Thanks. I don't know quite what to say after that introduction, Katrina. Thanks. All of my interactions with Katrina, I have to say, have been deeply pleasurable over all of those years, even though I don't always agree with her either. Now, Stuart suggested in a conversation that we had before I'd written this talk or given it really any much thought, that I might want to tackle the question of how transformative can we be. He also suggested I might want to use the title of Dealing with Transformation, but I'm going to try to leave the bad jokes of Stuart to one side. What I am not going to try to address in this talk, just to be really clear, is the pros and cons of transformative or transitional agreements. There's already been quite a bit of discussion around that over the past couple of days. It's an important conversation to have. My perspective is that transitional and transformative agreements aren't the way forward, but they are a way forward to delivering on a future of much greater open access. I do want to try to tackle the question that Stuart posed, though, of how transformative we can be. And I'm going to try to do that through sharing a combination of direct experience and also some opinions, which I know full well Katrina will be up to challenge and debate. And I'm going to try to illustrate it using actually a principle that Alex referred to in that first funder panel that we saw at the beginning of the meeting, which is that by collaborating, which by necessity means we have to compromise, we'll get there. It might take us a bit longer to do it that way, but the chances of success, I believe, are higher if we all learn how to compromise, collaborate, and work towards the common end goal, rather than arguing about what that is. Figuring out the way forward is where we should be headed. So before I really start there, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same baseline of basically how transforming we already are as an industry as a whole. So this slide shows some information that has been extracted from the ESAC database. So we already have more than 50, it's actually 56, I think, agreements in place across publishing, across institutions, and across consortia within the ESAC database. Now, the very first one of those came into effect in 2015, and in 2019 already, 35 new agreements have been added. So that shows just how much the pace of change is really picking up. And the scale of it is also substantial. There are now 45,000 articles that can be made openly available under the basis of these transitional/transformational deals. Now, one of the challenges quite often laid at the feet of transforming in this manner is that really the conversation is open only to the big three publishers, or that we dominate it. Or that the conversation is open to the biggest publishers who are able and willing to make these transitions. If you look at the database, you'll see there's actually a fair degree of diversity going on in there already. The agreements cover anywhere between 8 and 9,500 articles a year. I think 20 of those agreements cover fewer than 100 articles a year, and there's something like 18 different publishers already listed in it. And they span a real range of activities, from some of the very biggest of us through to some very small society publishers with just a small handful of titles, and also to some national publishing organizations as well. So the diversity is there. There is room to grow and to continue to diversify, but it's not as constrained as sometimes we might believe it to be. And I want to talk a little bit about what it might have been that got us to this stage. And I would largely argue it's a continuation of some past behaviors. I'll come back to the qualifier on that. But it's certainly true that business models employed by publishers and negotiated by institutions have not stood still. 25 years ago, which at least was a bit before I got involved in publishing, the sole sales model was title by title, print subscriptions, sold typically on an annual basis. And that largely transferred into the digital arena when the first online journals began to appear. But it was around probably the late 1990s and early 2000s that we began to see the first bits of experimentation with licenses that covered not just subscribed content, but also access to additional content. So far, so good. The models are changing and progressing, partly in line with what publishers are able to deliver, partly with what customers were wanting to be able to purchase for their patrons. Now, it was around the end of that period, the early 2000s, where there were two fairly significant developments, I would say, that occupy the minds of a good number of us in this room. So the first one was that hybrid became a thing. Typically, the big publishers started engaging with hybrid between around 2003 and 2005. Uptake remained very low for many years, as we know. The other thing that became a much bigger deal around that time was the big deal. And this, at the time, was a definite effort to optimize the balance between coverage and cost. I know there will be many arguments about whether that succeeded or failed, but it carried us probably through about the next 10 years to the next period of experimentation, which is where scope came into being. It's where we began to see some of the first offsetting deals. So JISC and Wiley started an offsetting agreement back in 2015. IOPP in the UK and in Austria also had some early offsetting agreements, and we began to see the first of the Springer Compact agreements starting to come through around that stage as well. So there has always been this air of experimentation, change, and development for as long as at least digital publishing has been a reality. It was around, actually, the time of those early experiments in offsetting that I first joined the OASP Program Committee, which I had the great privilege of serving on for, I think it was 5 years. And in my very first call, I remember a lot of really good ideas coming in from everyone else on it, and then I piped up and said, how about we have a session on whether hybrid can ever be a mechanism to transition to OA? And I can guarantee you that back in 2012, I think that was, the tumbleweed went round the phone call until someone said, yeah, Liz, we don't really talk about hybrid at OASPA. And it was actually Paul who then, I think, said, you know what, if OASPA is diversifying its membership, if we've got interest in this kind of topic, we should have an airing of it. And we ended up having a really robust session, very robust discussion, I remember, with Falk Reckling, James Butcher from Springer, and me in the meeting in Riga. And now here we are just 5 years later talking about what transitional deals, which largely focus on that hybrid arena, are doing to really start moving the needle on what open access could be in the next few years. And I guess talking about the evolution of business models kind of implies a gradual trajectory of change and an enablement of change. But I'm not sure, well, I know it's not fair to characterize the agreement that we reached with Deal and some of the other developments we're seeing in the market at the moment as just another step on the path to the future. It wasn't. It was really quite seismic. And I've also been asked to talk a little bit about how we came to the kinds of decisions we did that enabled us not to just make that kind of gradual change and slowly be pulled into this world, potentially, but to actually step forward with both feet very strongly. So I am going to take you back a little bit to November 2017. We were stuck at that stage. We've been talking with Deal and with the librarians associated with Deal for over a year. And we'd got to the point where we'd hit a stalemate. And it was a very tense stalemate as well. So we knew that we had a very big decision to make. And the decision was very binary. There was a question of whether we chose to kind of root ourselves in our 200-year history, where we had a very strong, still, subscription program and all the values that we associated with that and still do, coupled with a fast-growing and very dynamic open access program, or did we take the opportunity to really pivot and change and make some very forward-looking moves? And that was not an easy decision to make, as I'm sure you'll understand. There were risks on both sides. The benefits weren't always clear. But nonetheless, just kind of trying to sit on the fence and do both things was not going to be a viable option going forward. I have jumped forward a bit too fast there. No, I haven't. There we go. So there were a host of complex factors that played into this decision. It burned up many hours. It burned up much more Excel than anyone, I think, would ever have dreamed possible could be used in the business of scholarly publishing, and certainly a lot of PowerPoints as well. But there were really, I'm not going to take you through the whole process, but there were a couple of major things that played a role in the decision that we took in the end. So one of them was absolutely the external dynamics that were going on at the time. And here I'm not just talking about Deal, I'm talking about all of the dynamics we were seeing. Our negotiations with Deal were playing out against a backdrop in which Coalition S was coming together, and which we were beginning to engage with a little bit, and we were beginning to get a sense of the direction that Plan S would take, and some of the pronouncements were beginning to come out too. So that definitely had an impact. we were seeing, and a lot of other publishers I'm talking to have talked about the influence that this has had on their decisions as well. We were seeing new players having a very strong influence on the environment that we were in. So we were seeing academic leaders, we were seeing funders, governments, and policymakers not only laying down policy expectations, but also their expectations of what agreements with publishers should constitute and how they should be enabled and delivered. And we were also seeing, in some circumstances, some of those very same strong influences coming directly to the negotiating table and putting their points across to us very clearly. That was a complete change. They were no longer just consortia leaders and leading librarian directors coming to these meetings, but academics, rectors, presidents who were very keen to drive the change that they wanted to see. We've seen this now unroll in a number of negotiations, actually. There's often academic leaders somewhere involved. And from my perspective, I would say it's really helpful when they're directly at the table. There's a couple of different models. In a few of the negotiations we are dealing directly with everyone who has a voice in the negotiation. In others, we have the consortia or library leaders at the table, and then the rectors and the presidents and so on behind them. From the perspective of a publisher, it is better if we can all get around the table and share our expectations right from the very outset. I found that with some of the other structures, it can lead to misunderstandings, and in our experience, it has certainly led to delays in us being able to get things done because we're having two almost separate conversations. It's not to diminish the role at all of the librarians in the middle, but you can have a much more full and frank exchange of views and what may work and what might not if you're all in the same room. Internally, there was never any doubt, though, for us that we wanted to remain in the business of scholarly publishing after 200 years. It wouldn't be a surprise for you to hear that. So we then spent a huge amount of time and energy in a strategic planning process that looked at all of those external pressures that I've just talked about and looked at a huge number of different factors that might come into play depending on what decisions we might choose to take or choose not to take. So we produced the biggest model I have ever seen of a very complex set of parameters that would come into play, again, not only if we went forward with deal, but in the full recognition that if we were to do so, there would be other events and we'd be making a statement that would carry on not exactly a chain reaction, but where we were setting out a stall that we wanted to continue to fulfill. And it didn't matter which parameters we looked at or whatever combination we put them together in, and we looked at loads. We looked at the potential rate of transition, we looked at the volume of transition, we looked at pricing pressure, whether on APCs or subscriptions, we looked at actions and reactions that competitors might take, we looked at the actions and reactions that our society partners might take. We still did not end up with a crystal ball. I so wish I had a crystal ball to share with you, but we don't. So what we came out with was a model that gave us a range of scenarios against which we had to test our levels of comfort, both at the time with the decisions we're making and that we can now use to track how well we are faring against those different things and therefore what levers we may choose to pull or not to pull, to course correct and so on. There was another area we had to deal with when I'm talking about comfort, and in this case, for Wiley, the discomfort of not engaging in a heavy consultative period with our partner societies, of which there are more than 600. Typically, when we make significant decisions, we engage in consultation with those partners. We would not have been able to engage in consultation with 600 partners and come out with consensus. It would just have been impossible. What we chose to do instead was sit down and explore with a handful of them the very decisions we were having to make. We weren't presenting them with solutions, we were presenting them with the problem and asking them, both in their shoes and in ours, to tell us what they thought might be the most viable way forward. We were very conscious, all the while that we were working this through, that whatever decisions we were making for ourselves were going to play out 600 more times for all of those partners, so we weren't ignoring their requirements, but getting to consensus would not have worked. So we came out with a very clear idea from all of that work that adapting to what was being asked of us in Germany and elsewhere could be a sustainable and a viable way forward for us. And when I say us, that means everyone in the organization. Katrina has said very kind things about me today. There is no way this would have happened without the complete buy-in of our board of directors and also of our chief executive, Brian Napak, who's actually been involved in some of these directly himself as well. We knew that taking that way forward was going to mean compromise on our part. It would certainly mean we weren't always going to get what we want. And we were also clear that there would need to be compromise on the other side as well, having already had some insight into it. And I'm sharing this thinking because I know that every publishing organization, every mixed model publishing organization I know of has either gone through or is going through and continues to go through exactly the same kind of process themselves. I don't think that there is anything less complex or more easy or less impactful if you're a small publisher than a large publisher, or if you're non-profit rather than commercial, or if you're mission-driven. This is a really difficult environment to navigate through and figure out what your best options might be, or what options you might choose to take that fundamentally change everything. I've been really impressed by the work that I've seen come out of the SPA Ops project in trying to draw together some of that narrative and way of thinking for a number of smaller organizations, and especially that it offers a number of ways forward to engage with all of this as well. I think it's supremely helpful, because only by sharing the ways in which we are assessing our futures and figuring out what could happen in future are we really going to make progress, and I think we'll get there faster by sharing too. I also know, and Tasha's spoken up a couple of times already today, that smaller publishers are beginning to make a great deal of headway in this space. So it's very interesting to watch what's going on there. I know that it is harder for them to get to the table. I know, and Tasha's told me this before, that as well as for us, we have to get used to the new and different kinds of players at the table. For organizations like the Microbiology Society, they're having to figure out how consortia work. Consortia have been part of our lives for 20 plus years. It's not true for these smaller organizations, and I think these institutional models are also going to be really interesting, and I think there is potential for them to succeed where it might be harder, actually, for the bigger publishers to engage. There's a difference in scale here where I think both have an option to work at either end of the spectrum. To cut a very long story short on all of this work that we did, we realized that by reaching this conclusion, we could come back to the table in Germany and in other places and say, we can now share that endpoint. We can share the goal that you are trying to achieve. The hard work is going to come in figuring out how we get there. The hard work is going to come in which areas we're going to compromise in and which areas you are going to compromise in likewise. That was what we were able to do by engaging in that big piece of work that delivered that full institutional buy-in from the organization. You all know the outcome, I think. 15th of January this year, Wiley and Deal announced the biggest transformational agreement to date. We were very proud of that. I think it's still fair to say that not everyone expected Wiley to come out first with it. What you know a bit less about is an assumption that we all made at the time, that although getting there was hard, and it was tough and it was difficult, delivering on it was just going to be so much harder. And when I say harder, I mean a huge amount of work. Cameron made the point yesterday, I think, that everyone has to be prepared to invest. Everyone has to be prepared to put a massive amount of trust and effort into all of these processes. And that's really what we've been doing over the course of the past 6 months. It's also why you haven't seen us or heard from us for about 6 months. We have been squirreled away in rooms that are much darker and deeper than this, making sure that we could deliver on the agreement, because delivering is actually the most important part. There's a huge amount of dedication and, frankly, really bloody hard work that has to go into making these things happen at scale. So we were able to switch on full gold open access and provide access to read content in Germany within the space of a week. That was great. Hooray. And we all heaved a huge sigh of relief at that. We then had to deal with the heavy lift of implementing the hybrid piece for 700 institutions, covering approximately 10,000 articles a year, each of which may have a unique and therefore 10,000 corresponding authors per year. That is no small task. We are immensely grateful to Ralph Schimmer and the amazing team at MPDL for working with us on this. Together, we formed, I think it was 11 working groups. We've stood some of them down now, covering everything from communications to access provision to open access workflows to, I can see Colleen up in the back. She might remember some of these better than I do right now. Reporting. Reporting. That's a whole different talk in its own right. We've had to do that all the way through by continually referring to all of the different stakeholders we have in this process, because if we take our eye off their balls for any 1 minute, this is not going to work. We have to take care of them every single step of the way. And the third point on this slide I wanted to make, there was a tweet coming out of another publishing conference a couple of weeks ago that I know was misquoted, so I'm not going to quote it or the person who was quoted. But there was a suggestion that transition could be a distraction from the core business of publishing. I hope I have demonstrated through this that the transition is now our core business. We have huge amounts of people devoted to this, thinking about it. We have all of our editorial and publishing staff talking to their editors and their societies on a regular basis about the options and the obligations and the requirements that this places upon them. It's right across the entire organization. It's making these agreements work. Deal is the single biggest one, but it doesn't mean there aren't others that we're doing. Now, we switched hybrid on time on the 1st of July, thanks to the dedication of all of those teams that I spoke about. And since then, we've had almost daily doses of positive feedback via Twitter. And the reason I bring that up is because that is the single most important thing. The only way that we're going to aid the transition to open access for those places that want it and for where it works via this method is by giving authors a good experience. That has also come up a number of times over the course of this week. If your very first experience of open access is under the terms of one of these agreements and it's a bad experience, your experience of open access is bad. And that's not something any of us want to be associated with. So making sure that we are focused hardcore on the successful implementation and execution of these agreements is massively important. So you may have noticed I have used the word transitional and transformative quite a lot now. And one of the things I was asked if I would consider doing, and which I really tried to dodge doing, was giving a definition to what I think transitional or transformative is. Now, I have seen various attempts at describing transitional and transformative and some very clever analyses, and I have disagreed with at least some parts of all of them, and in some cases I've disagreed with all parts of them. And that's not because I think that the people doing the analyses don't know what they're talking about and aren't very clever. I'm certainly got no better insights than them to offer. I think it's a very tricky thing to do, to try to break down the technical requirements of an individual agreement and say, is this transformative? Is this transitional? Is it one or the other? Is it a bit of both, or does it fit neither definition? And I think that's partly for a reason that I was talking to Dave Ross from Sage about, is that what is transformative for one publisher is not going to be transformative for another. What is transformative for one country or one consortium or one institution is not going to be transformative for another. So instead, what I'd like to do is return to some of the principles that I think govern whether something is genuinely transitional or transformative. And it's principles that are beginning to emerge in common from initiatives like OA 2020, like Plan S, and I will say like some of the changes the industry is making as well, that potentially give us a useful framework in which to consider what transitional and transformative really means. I think it's a much more helpful lens on the question. So I picked 4. I am very conscious that in other places there's a much longer list, but I think these 4 really encapsulate what transitional or transformative agreements need to be able to meet. So the first of those is equality of provision. And what I mean by that is that authors should be able to publish under the terms of these agreements without anyone being favored over and above any other. So an ability to pay from the author perspective should not be an issue for inclusion in these agreements. The second principle is transparency, and this comes in 2 doses. So one, we're pretty responsive to requests to not put the contracts for these things behind closed doors. the waters of transparency are a little bit murky. Not all of the contracts are out there, and in some cases there are redactions that I would say go significantly beyond simply GDPR-type considerations. And as we move into the next phase of transparency, the work that's being done around pricing transparency, for example, by UKRI and Welcome, I do think it's important that we're all held to the same or very similar standards. Now, talking about standards takes us on to the third one, and these are framed out both in ESAC and Plan S. And the way I'd consider them is more that they lay a series of expectations at the feet of publishers about the quality thresholds that we have to meet when we're providing services both to researchers and authors when publishing with us and to the administrators of these agreements at the other side. And then we get on to the big, bold principle, the last one. This is about shifting the focus away from reading to publishing. It's shifting the focus and the logic and the investment that the people who are paying for these agreements are choosing to make. This is one of the biggest drivers of variance that we see in the agreements that we're making and that others are making. I'll give you an example. The publish and read PAR concept that Colleen referred to when she was talking on the panel was an essential thing to get the Wiley and Deal agreement over the line. It was a very pragmatic solution to the fact that Deal wanted to focus on and invest in the process of publishing as part of the transition to open access. Wiley was equally insistent that there was a value to reading and that that value needed some form of expression in the agreement we're reaching. So the PAR construct works really well there. We know it's not going to work for everybody. There are various reasons why it doesn't. So one is that some simply prefer the clarity of agreements like the ones we've reached in Norway, others have reached elsewhere, where the contracts very explicitly state how much is being paid for the reading service and how much is being paid for the publishing service. There is a problem for an awful lot of negotiating bodies we talk to in being able to commit to the potentially unconstrained expenditure that the PAR model lends it to. We were kind of pleased to see that the MOU with Springer sort of reflects a similar construct because it clearly works for Germany. And that's good. It means we don't have to keep reinventing the horses all the time. And there is some commonality in what's being delivered. But if we look for commonality in standards everywhere, then I think we will slow down the rate of transition. We know that one size doesn't fit all. The PAR construct in Germany was not developed to suit everybody for the reasons that I've outlined. It's also true to say that what one very large country can agree with a very large publisher is very different to what can be delivered through the kind of agreements that Tasha and others are trying to develop for a smaller publisher at institutional level or sometimes at consortial level too. But what I would do for all of those reasons is encourage everyone to think about what transitional or transformative agreements are through the lens of these or similar principles rather than trying to do a forensic dissection of every individual agreement. So another question that I get asked quite a lot is, where are we going to end up? And when are we going to end up there? And I don't have the answer for that one either, but I can share some information with you about where Wiley is currently. And what this map will show you is where we've got agreements in place right now that I believe fit those principles, where we have active negotiations underway, and where we're beginning some early and preliminary conversations reflecting some interests. Now, it is very clear from the discussions we've had this week, if it wasn't already to everyone, that transitioning towards an APC model will not work for all. That's another reason why I'm saying these agreements are a way forward, not the way forward. And you can see that that's sort of reflected in the interests here. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time this year in Asia, in the US, and in South Africa listening and talking to customers there about what they might want. And what has become crystal clear to me over the course of those and some other visits is that these kind of large-scale transformational deals cannot happen without a collective purpose and a collective will that is shared between the institutions, the consortia, the funders, the research communities to a degree, the policymakers. It doesn't matter how well motivated any one of those players is individually to make something happen and how open an individual publisher might be to make something happen. If you can't bring those collective forces together, it's becoming very difficult to get this kind of deal over the line. And that is where I think the smaller publishers with their institutionally focused agreements that help standalone subscriptions or subscription packages start to migrate from open access really do have some potential to make big headway on behalf of everybody. Now, once we've entered into these negotiations, though, there are a lot of commonalities, not surprisingly, about what it is that customers are choosing to see. And the degree of emphasis we get on this varies and depends very much on institutional and individual circumstances. So surprise, surprise, the first priority is always price. Always. What's the total cost of this agreement going to be for me? And we get that. We get that budgets remain constrained. It's also true to say that APC flows, even in countries and places where there is a lot of support for gold, are also not always clear and not always potentially harnessable in support of these kinds of agreements. And we as publishers also have to face that a driving force behind some of these negotiations is an attempt to reduce the total cost of publishing and reading to the system. Now, Toby said very clearly yesterday in his talk that costs are going up in publishing. That is true. It's 100% true. And I'm not going to stand here and expect any sympathy, but what I can tell you is that supporting the transition, supporting open access, requires us to invest more and more in our infrastructure every single year, which we are doing, and we're happy to do. Everyone that I know of is doing it. But that makes it kind of, price is a fairly big priority for us too, you won't be surprised to hear. The second is almost always the speed of transition. Not all agreements allow for an immediate 100% transition to open access, so that's the next discussion point that we always have, is how far and how fast and how quickly can we make this happen. So from my perspective, that depends partly on the structure of the agreement, it depends partly on price, it depends partly on what else matters in the network. I will say it depends hugely on researcher behavior. We can put as much provision for open access as we can agree between us into an agreement, but if we can't get researchers to go there, then we're not going to get to 100%. I think we've all seen data from some of the other publishers, like at Springer and the RSC, about when there is unlimited open access, we're still typically seeing 80, 85, maybe 90% take-up. So we haven't got that whole researcher community buy-in yet. So the practicalities of speed are not necessarily the same as the negotiated speed. Workflows is a big part of our discussion, and sometimes these are interchangeable, but usually it's workflows for administrators first in the negotiations and researchers second. Here I'd make one observation and one plea. The observation is that I think initiatives like the Open Access Switchboard are going to be immensely helpful in helping with the many small agreements and also potentially with the institutional interactions with multiple different publisher workflows and dashboards. So there is a real potential role for intermediaries to play here in simplifying the system for all. My plea is that we try not to unleash our endless creativity on author workflows and author messaging. We heard this loud and clear in the lightning talk earlier. The more words we put in front of people, the more likely they are to get turned off. Now, I've kind of had that impression for a while, but I am so glad it's now fully out there in a properly described and written paper. We know that if we ask authors to make more decisions than are strictly necessary, if we put more screens in front of them than are strictly necessary in our workflows, they drop out at increasing rates. Simplifying has to reign in this environment. So observation, intermediaries, great place to work, and the plea, yeah, no creativity. Let's just keep it simple and carry as many authors with us as we can. Then we get to licensing. Unsurprisingly, everyone asks for CC BY for all. Now, we don't do that. Some mixed model publishers do, and some don't. The reasons we don't are twofold. So the first one is that actually I believe this should be a kind of contract, if you like, between the funder or their employer and the researcher, and not a publisher driving that kind of mandate. And the second reason is another pragmatic one. The pragmatic one is that we know that there are some communities and some individuals out there who have a fundamental objection, whether we agree with it or not, to CC BY. While we're in this transitional period, I would rather have more researchers choosing to make their work openly available under a restricted license and choosing not to make it open because they disagree solely with the license. So that's our thinking behind it. Can anyone spot what's missing? No request for a global flip. It's sometimes a point of discussion, it's never a point of negotiation. There is also no demand for a description of an endpoint either. That was what I was going to say until one particular group totally destroyed my narrative last week, when suddenly it has become a much bigger deal and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. And that is because customers need to know where they're investing their money now, and the decisions that they're choosing to make are going to stand them in good stead for the long term. So Spring and Nature have begun to air their proposals for transformative journals, which I think is really, really helpful. Begin to give us a way to articulate where investment in open of multiple forms is delivering benefits, and at what price and at what cost compared with the cost and benefit of subscription publishing. We can extend the principle of transparency a great deal over the course of the coming years, and that's got an air of inevitability about it anyway, and it's one that I really welcome. Now, I've mentioned partnership in the context of Wiley and Deal many times. That's where else we start to make real change. I meant it when I said partnership. We wouldn't have been able to get that agreement over the line if we hadn't been able to form a sense of trust and collaboration to make that thing happen. We tested it at times for sure, but we've come out stronger as a consequence. And working together in partnership is where we're going to deliver the real change. My sense is that the escalating tension we've felt over the past few years between those who felt the pace of change hasn't quite been fast enough, or hasn't been fast enough at all, and that publishers weren't moving fast enough, that tension is de-escalating just a little bit. We're making progress all of the time, and we still have a way to go. But from my perspective, we are having a qualitatively different conversation with funders, with senior research administrators, senior university administrators, senior libraries, than we're having 2 years ago, let alone 5 years ago. That means we have an opportunity to share the challenge of infusing this really diverse community of authors and researchers who have very divergent views, or often no views at all, which is possibly worse, on open access, and we need to deal with that challenge in the near term. In the longer term, actually in the midterm, I think there's a huge opportunity to move beyond just sharing the data around what is happening to our publishing portfolios as a consequence of this push and these deals for more open, and begin to open up the decision-making processes that we have. I was talking to Johan Rurik over lunch earlier, and he was unaware of some of the decisions we've taken around flips, the number of journals we've flipped to open access over the course of the past few years. We can open up not just the fact that we have done this, but also the why and what goes into the consideration of it, and what the decisions some of these customers are making have in terms of the impact on those decisions and others as we progress more to this future of open access. And as we start to have those conversations, we start to open up more and more about what the future of research communication needs to look like for researchers and for research leaders. And when we do that, we'll start to unlock the true potential of digital transformation, and that will have been as a consequence of these kind of open access transformations that we're trying to get over the line right now. So while we may not yet be in a position to define especially a truly global endpoint, I think we're in a position where we can say there are going to be many twists and turns and still more compromises to be made on that particular path. But the progress that we've been making collectively is really significant, and there's no turning back from this point. So thank you.
Thank you. It's fascinating to get that sort of insight, and I think actually having the sort of more open conversation about this is part of how we get there. So questions. Don't believe no one has a question. Oh dear, that means I get to ask them. So one of the issues I wanted to ask is Project Deal was with Germany, which is a country with a large sort of research output. What do transformative deals look like for developing countries? And that's part one. And part two is, to what extent are you looking at cooperative funding models?
Okay. I am not sure that transformative deals like the ones we've been talking about this afternoon and typically over the course of this meeting are the right models for developing countries. I think they can be. I'm not directly engaging in conversations with most of those kind of territories that you might be talking about yet, about what will work for them in this context, frankly, because we've just been so busy. We need to figure out what the answer is for those, for sure, and I don't have one yet. We are embarking in conversations. One of the countries I highlighted there, I wouldn't say it fits under the banner of developing, but it's certainly not Northern or Western European, with South Africa, where the library network there is very keen to make progress in transformative agreements. And we're looking forward to continuing the conversation there. Whether, again, that becomes a model for others, I don't know. And your second question was to do with cooperative. No, we are not within Wiley looking at cooperative agreements right now. Doesn't mean we won't or we shouldn't, but we're not.
Tasha, up the top, thank you.
So you mentioned at an early part of your talk that you engaged with a subset of your society partners. How have your society partners reacted to the fairly radical shift in approach from Wiley? Is this something they're comfortable with? And how transparent are you being about how this is going to change their revenue flows?
Okay, right, good question. So yeah, the consultation process we embarked on was with a small number of UK societies, a couple of European federations, and a couple of the big US societies as well. And like I said, we took them through the decision-making process in the same way we took internal people in Wiley through it. When we announced the deal agreement, the response was universally positive, and I'm not just saying, it genuinely was. We were waiting for a "what are you doing to me" type response, and it did not come. Everyone was really, really pleased about it. They were keen to see progression being made that kept their publisher, their publishing relevant in the face of some of the pressures that I described. There is certainly concern around what this does to financial flows, not deal specifically, but what this whole changing environment does. But I think there is a recognition that the kind of digging your heels in approach that we could have chosen to take and that societies can still choose to take is not an option that's going to be viable for any of us in the mid to long term. So we're in this period of significant uncertainty and complexity, but it's only by engaging in it we're really going to understand where it can possibly go. We do have more work to do to make sure we're continually kind of informing and re-informing our society partners of the challenges of this environment. I agree with what Rasmus said earlier and what various people from Springer have said at certain points. These deals take ages and ages and ages. The longest one we negotiated was 4 years. I think the quickest was a little under a year. And so it's hard for us to say very upfront, we're close to doing an agreement with Norway, for example, as we have done, because things can twist and turn and then push out for another 6 or 12 months. In terms of the transparency around the financial impact of this, with Project Deal, we described, I think clearly, although it's not necessarily that simple, we described very clearly what the change in the allocation mechanism was for society partners between reading and publishing, and we gave them a model that was based on their German output and their German subscription revenues that said, this is what we estimate, because it can only be an estimate, the impact will be on you. We do hear from our societies that they would like more modeling and more help with modeling to see what future trajectories might be, and we've got to figure out how we might be able to help them do that. It will be full of what-ifs for the reasons I've described. There are, by the way, at least one, if not more, of our society partners in here, so if any of them either wish to comment or wish to be spoken to later, raise your hand.
Up the top and then down.
Thank you. Could you expand more on your thoughts about flipping and why it doesn't make sense and for what journals you think it does?
Yeah, sure. So we've had a run of flips over the course of the past few years, and we also flipped some journals in partnership with Hindawi as well. One example I can give you, and I don't mean a specific journal example, is some of the journals we flipped in the very earliest days were in the life and biomedical sciences field, where we weren't really looking at open access output, hybrid uptake or whatever. We were thinking about what is the preference of this author community, and is this journal viable? Can we more or less replace the subscription revenues or whatever, or at least make it stand on its own 2 feet as an open access journal? That's a relatively easy thing to do in the life and biomedical sciences. We have a big program of social sciences and humanities journals. If you look at those, even if, let's say we had the German Journal of German Humanitarian Studies, that potentially under the terms of Project Deal could now be 90% open access. The challenge of flipping that for the remaining 10% who are not covered by an agreement like this and who don't have access to APCs, maybe 90% is a bit extreme, but even if so, if it was north of 50%, you are still potentially then in this environment right now closing that journal off to other authors. So we might choose not to make that decision there. And then the journals we flipped with Hindawi were largely in kind of physical sciences, mathematical sciences, where we weren't quite sure that we could make them a successful flip. It was a bit of a period of experimentation, and that partnership has worked out really well as well, so we've learned a lot from that too. But those are the kind of decisions we're looking at.
Thank you. Curtis Brendy from Iowa State. So 2 unrelated questions. The first one is, based on your modeling, where are the how many of the articles, what percentage of the articles are coming from the low and middle income countries, the developing countries, whatever you want to call them?
I'm tempted to look at one of my dear colleagues in the front row here for the answer to this. Not a huge proportion. I will say, I couldn't, honestly, if I give you a percentage right now, I will get it wrong. I'm happy to follow up. I'm not trying to obfuscate on it. I just don't know the answer.
I think that would be helpful to understand the scale of what that problem could be with potentially excluding, or underfunded authors. Mm-hmm. Second question has to do with the U.S. market. So if you're a transition company now, and that's the way that you're moving, what can we expect in the U.S. market with seeing like institutional level versions of these agreements that we can tackle? My last conversation with David Fisher, he was pitching the Ohio Link OA Fund version of this, which is definitely not transformative. And I think you know that you're still fielding a subscription sales staff in the U.S. market.
Yeah, so I'm not going to, I don't know about the conversation that you've had with David. What I can say is that the way I see the Ohio Link agreement and also the Viva one is that this is a step on the road for US consortia in particular that haven't yet had an opportunity to engage with OA. And part of it is understanding the publication choices that their authors are making. So the infrastructure they get as part of this starts to tell them who is publishing where, and that's useful information for them. One of the points that I didn't make in response to a question Stuart raised about are transformative agreements going to be confined to Northern Europe or Europe full stop? Clearly not. California tells us it's not, right? The decisions California makes are showing us very clearly that there are bits of the US who are structured and ready to go. My point earlier about this kind of collective drive, I truly believe is what is needed in the US, and I think it's what's missing because the funders aren't really engaging in this yet. From Wiley's perspective, we mostly are engaged, whether it's a traditional sales model or one of these newer ones, at the consortial level. And I am not in the sales team, so I don't know quite what the individual institutional dynamic is here that you're asking about. But there is a willingness to enter into conversation and figure out what might suit different institutions, different consortia at different stages, and see whether we can make it work.
Oh, Cameron.
And I've got the mic. I'm Cameron Nayland. Thanks for that. So a lot of your talk was really about how you managed or assessed the financial risks you were taking and thinking about. And it's been a conversation that we've had, but I'm not sure, and I think we're now in a position to actually answer whether this would be useful. Would it have made a difference if we'd had a mechanism, wave hands, to underwrite some of that risk as a collective community? Would it have made a difference to Wiley, and do you think it's something that could make a difference to other players in a system of different scales and sizes? And if so, if you can say this without necessarily giving away commercial secrets, how much money would we be talking about? How much would we have to insure to try and make that happen?
I remember Cameron coming up with a humdinger of a question when we had that session in Riga, and you've done it again. I would say, actually, in the case of Deal, that was exactly what happened in Germany. The Deal negotiators went out and made sure that they would be in a position to underwrite what the agreement we had negotiated was going to take in order to be delivered. And this is partly why I say that this collective will of funders and policymakers and institutional leaders all needs to be there. I probably wouldn't be able to put a number on it from just standing here and giving out numbers like that anyway, and I certainly don't know what it would be. I think it is a very interesting question for everyone to think about, is how can we collectively, again, provide the surety, the confidence that all stakeholders need to be able to drive this kind of change through. It's an interesting one. We should talk about it.
So we're almost finished. I just want to ask one final question, because you talked about the transparency of the process and the commitment that Wiley's got to transition. And I think supporting that risk and managing that process is good. I think publishers of all shapes and sizes add value. But how can we create a healthier market that doesn't just have top 3 or 4 publishers, that allows innovation from different players? And is Wiley seriously looking at those issues?
We are looking at how we continue to evolve the services that we can provide to researchers to make their lives easier when they're publishing. We're looking at all of the spectrum of events you would expect us to around engagement with preprints and all of the upstream things. We're paying close attention to the kind of developments that Matt was talking about in the session just before here, with different workflows that suit authors and so on in different ways, and that try to bring innovation into the process. I think, again, it was Colleen who earlier in the week described how, by virtue of making some of these agreements, funds are opened up in order for other publishing models to come into play. We are up for a bit of experimentation as well. And I should say, and this kind of marries your question and Cameron's together a little bit as well, we are conscious that there is risk in this system for us too, and so we're taking our own sort of part in that as well. If we don't evolve and change and innovate, I'm not going to be standing here, or no one from Wiley is going to be standing here in a few years' time talking about what these transitional and transformational agreements have also allowed us to go on to do. And that's where we want to be able to shift to, as well as this future of providing much more open access for those who want it and are in a position to be able to make it happen.
Thanks very much, Liz. So please,
Thank you.